All right, we're going to go live. Click. And we're live. It is Wednesday, December 1st, 2021, 5:02 p.m. We are 2 minutes late because Stewart Baker was telling a amusing story about Michigan. I know that some of you have waited with bated breath for 24 hours for this, so I am going to give you an update. I did get a response from Clothing Monster about the fate of Fluffy Poodle Shirt. I just want to read it to you. It says, "Dear Benjamin, we are investigating why you did not receive the third t-shirt. We will get back to you ASAP about this. Unfortunately, we do not have a possibility to participate with you live show during the due to Christmas period. Our phone number is 917-720-3320. It is also available on the website, and they usefully include a screenshot. We apologize for any inconvenience we might have caused. Thank you, customer service." Now, this raises several questions. The first is whether Mr. or Mrs. Monster's actual name is Mr. or Mrs. Service, first name customer, because it is not signed Clothing Monster, Mr. Monster or Ms. Monster. It's signed customer service. The second is, I think, the improbable English usage related to the impossibility of coming on the show to discuss the fate of Fluffy Poodle Shirt suggests that we are actually dealing with a foreign operation here. And the third, and that raises questions of foreign interference in dog shirts, which I'm very concerned about. And then finally, just to be candid, look, they did catch me in an error. They do have a phone number on their website. I was wrong about that. I always try to correct my errors. Yes, they have a phone number, and it goes straight to voicemail, and they don't answer it. So we are not allowed to have fun anymore, but there is a pending investigation of the fate of Fluffy Poodle Shirt. We will get to the bottom of this. And in the meantime, we have Stewart Baker here, and I have exactly two things to tell you about Stewart Baker. The first is that, and I'm sure he's going to say some things today that are going to piss some of you off. That's okay. Stewart is the closest thing to an intellectual mentor that I have in the world of national security law. I met him when I was a 23-year-old reporter, and he was the former general counsel of the National Security Agency. And the Congress of the United States had just augmented the jurisdiction of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court in order to solve the problem of the physical search conducted by the FBI against Aldrich Ames. And I had to write a story about it, and I called Stewart Baker because he was at Steptoe and Johnson, having just left NSA. This was the first time he returned to Steptoe and Johnson, or maybe the second. And he does hold the record for returning to Steptoe and Johnson the most times. And this was the first or second time. But he took a young reporter of a lefty civil libertarian bent, i.e. me, and converted him to the dark side over a number of years of great conversations. And so I want to say, whatever Stewart says today to piss you off, deal with it. And the second thing I want to say about Stewart is, one day I asked him where his politics came from, and he said, "You know, that's an interesting question, Ben. I'm an anti-authoritarian, but all of my authority figures have been liberals." And that is, I think, the secret to Stewart. Most of it is just him being mischievous and tweaking libs. Stewart, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. It is discouraging to reflect the arc of our careers since those conversations. Says mine has stalled and yours has gone through the roof. So it is.
What do you mean? You're sitting there with a parrot. I'm wearing a dog shirt.
That's true. The parrot is good. The parrot is from my human rights trip to El Salvador in 1985 or 6. The parrot has held up much better than the country.
Yeah. El Salvador not doing so well, though doing better than Honduras right now.
Yeah. I remember there was when I was down there, they had a poll, and they asked people in El Salvador, would you move to the United States if you could? And something like 75% of the population said, yep, tomorrow.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there is actually in your former DHS. So Stewart wears many hats. He's a national security lawyer, but he was also Mike Chertoff's sort of policy deputy at DHS in the sort of second half of the Bush administration. And in that capacity, you actually had to deal with a lot of immigration stuff.
I was kind of the policy lead for the second effort to get a comprehensive immigration deal through. It failed, as did the first. There's that Casey Stengel story about the shortstop who keeps dropping grounders, and Stengel goes out and says, let me show you how to do it. And the first ball that is hit to him hits a pebble and hits him in the nose. And he throws down his glove and he says to the shortstop, he says, you've screwed this position up so bad, nobody can play it. That's what we call comprehensive immigration.
So the Bush administration, for those who don't remember, was actually seeking a policy rather similar to the policy that Joe Biden purports to want now. The Obama administration was something of a deviation from that. The Trump administration was a deviation. Like, when you look at the state of the border now and what happened during the Trump administration, as well as the incredible refugee flow or migrant flow that's happening from the Northern Triangle, like, what would be the right policy for somebody of, what's the right way to think about what to do about the border at this point?
So I would start from the point of view that you would think would be obvious. We can't take everybody. There are 1 billion people who would come to the United States if they had the ticket and were allowed. We can't take everybody. So then the question becomes, well, how are we going to decide who we're going to take? It seems to me that it makes sense for us to control that decision, and for us to try to get people who will make us a more successful country. And that means as many skilled people as we can get, and to focus on the skills of the immigrants. Since we have a scarce resource that lots of people want, we ought to get something for it, which is, on the whole, getting good, employable, smart people who will work hard and make the country more successful. I'm not sure that's really controversial, but it is not our policy. Our policy now is to take the relatives of people who are already here legally, plus a few small number of people that tech companies want to bring in, and then to let occasional, large numbers of people just walk across the border and stay without any serious vetting. There's some vetting, but without making any determination other than, well, they showed up here, I guess we're going to keep them. So I think that's the problem we're facing now. The people who govern those flows are quite sophisticated. There's a whole organization of people who are trying to facilitate illegal immigration. They get paid for it. So they have good information about what will happen if you cross the border illegally. And every once in a while, because of the complexity of the system, it turns out that if you cross the border, the U.S. facilities for deporting people and for holding them until deportation break down, and people just have to be admitted. If they make a claim of asylum, they will stay for 5 or 6 or 10 years while their claim is adjudicated. By that point, nobody is going to send them home, and they will have worked for 10 years in the United States, which is a great deal too. So everybody's going to take that deal. And so my sense is you have to make sure that you don't have a collapse of the ability to process people as they cross the border and persuade the people who are behind them that this is not the way to get into the United States. We've completely failed. I don't think that a wall is a particularly impressive response to that. I don't think Trump was really a big business Republican, but with attitude. And so he didn't really want to do any of the things that would make it hard to get a job after you come here illegally, because he probably had employed a lot of those people illegally himself. And so we haven't had any effort to discourage people from coming here other than stopping them at the border. Once they got past the border, they were golden. And that's probably not a workable way to discourage large numbers of people from crossing the border.
But we're not here to talk immigration. We're here to talk cyber. So I want to. First of all, I want to say that I'm ever so slightly obsessed with you, because so I'm used to people making insane claims all the time and making arguments for it. They're called philosophers. Normally, lawyers don't do that. What I find really so fascinating about you is you're really, in my humble opinion, you're really smart and you're really knowledgeable. And I'm just really so curious, first of all, how you became such a cybersecurity law, cyber privacy, tech god. And also, why are you so conservative?
Yeah, good question. Or as David Chris said just before our last episode, he said, I just love the podcast, even the batshit crazy parts.
Right.
We're gonna get to the batshit crazy parts in a minute, Stuart.
No, but the thing is, but it's not. That's the great thing about it. This is not InfoWars like crazy stuff. Like you have really interesting, very well thought through ideas, and so I'm really fascinated by.
This is a really polite way of saying, "What's a nice girl like you doing?"
That's exactly it.
Exactly. So let me start with getting into cyber. I ended up at the National Security Agency as the general counsel because I got called by they had a problem, I think, recruiting, and they kind of made a second effort, and they asked a woman who was at the State Department, who had been general counsel of NSA and CIA, to do some recruiting, and she called Monroe Lee, who had been the legal advisor of the State Department, and asked him if he had any ideas. He was my mentor at Steptoe. And he later said in a moment of candor, I said, well, I gave her your name, Stuart, because I thought you were smart enough not to take the job. But I did take the job, and there's a story there. But when I got there, they were in a death fight with Microsoft, which believed in the coming of the internet and believed that the internet really should be Microsoft network. And it would provide everything that we want from the internet. And one of the things that they were sure was going to happen is internet commerce. People would buy stuff on the internet and they would have to use their credit card, and they'd be afraid to use their credit card if they didn't have encryption to protect it. And so Microsoft said, our business model requires that we offer really good encryption around the world. And NSA's vision of the world was nobody would have good encryption outside the United States because NSA wanted to be able to listen to their conversations. And it was as fundamental to NSA's sense of what it was as breaking other people's business model and turning it into software was to Microsoft. Because, the NSA traces its history back to breaking codes of the Japanese and the Nazis.
For everyone, just so everyone knows, this is 1994 when Microsoft, instead of going to the internet, tried to create this Microsoft kind of walled garden at the same time that you're having the crypto wars and the Clipper chip. So I had never connected these two things together. It's fascinating.
And in this period, as the sitting general counsel of NSA, Stewart went and gave a speech. Was it at Black Hat?
No, it was Computers, Freedom, and Privacy. I don't think it exists anymore.
And he opened the speech that said, with a line that I'll never forget, it said, "With all the enthusiasm of a Southern Baptist church being asked to turn its pulpit over on a Sunday morning to the devil, the Computers, Freedom, and Privacy Conference has invited me to speak to you today."
It's true. And I continued in that vein for a considerable period of time. And actually, I appeared in Wired magazine. They turned it into an article in the very first year that Wired magazine existed. Yes, it was. I have to say, irreverent and smartass and anti-authoritarian if you thought that Wired magazine and Microsoft were authority figures. So yes. So
as a representative of the National Security Agency.
Exactly. No, but my goal, my job was, they basically said to me, your job is to head this off. And meanwhile, all these, people with neckbeards were telling me, this is the future, you have to understand it. And so I actually said, okay, if I'm going to fight on this ground, I have to understand why they're saying these things, why they think the internet is such a big deal, et cetera, et cetera. And so I got into it, and they persuaded me that the internet was going to be a big deal, and that shaped my approach to my practice when I got out. It shaped my advocacy while I was in. And that's really where my career took a turn that it has never quite recovered from, doing technology law. And it's fun. I mean, you have to learn something new every week or you're out of date. And that's exciting.
What about the part of Scott's question, how you became such a wingnut?
Yeah, so I think it is true that I actually think I said that I grew up in a household where the ultimate authority figure was the New York Times editorial board. It's a problem you've had from time to time too.
It is. Although I've moderated my response in a way that you have not.
Exactly.
So I want to pull the conversation back to an area where I think David may have been talking about when he said the phrase batshit crazy. And I want to actually pose this question to you. You are, I think, the most respectable and maybe the only respectable voice who argues that the tech company algorithms really are biased against conservatives. And I want to give you a chance to justify that, because most people I know, including people you've argued about with it on the Cyberlaw podcast, believe there is no empirical evidence for it whatsoever, and actually believe the opposite may be true, that the platforms kind of bend over backwards to not get rid of conservative accounts. So what is the case for an audience of people who are primed to understand the basic claim as lunacy? What is the non-lunatic case that Twitter and Facebook actually have an algorithmic bias against conservative voices?
So let's start with institutional incentives. If you don't believe that the New York Times has a liberal bias, then I'm not going to persuade you. But I think it's indisputable that the New York Times leans left in the kinds of cases it decides to promote. Everybody remembers, I hope, the Augusta National debacle, where they just campaigned against the Augusta National Country Club for months for something, I forget, women or something. And it was just because they had a thing about the Augusta National Country Club, and on and on. But if you look at the workforce of the New York Times, it's because they by and large lean left. You don't see people being tossed off the New York Times payroll because they have said something wildly conservative. They may have been tossed off because it was too conservative for the current workforce, but the tweets that come out of that workforce are, when they're crazy left. And the only workforce that is more crazy left on average, I would argue, is the workforce in Silicon Valley, where the contributions to campaigns are 95% Democratic or more. The workforce is raising questions about whether they should even work for the Defense Department of the United States. Those kinds of questions are all questions that you only ask if you're in a pretty liberal filter bubble already. So why would they not want to express their values through the controls that they have? And then you look at decisions. I mean, all of this, at this point, it becomes anecdotal. You cannot say, as I recognize there are people who will say, well, gee, look, how many of the stories that are popular on Facebook are from conservatives? They're obviously, if anything, leaning to the right. But I think, you can cut that either way. Maybe if they were not holding down conservative share of the mind share, there'd be even more popularity. So all is that with this level of control, you get a substantial number of people sharing conservative views. I think that's because most people are conservative, and the country is more conservative than the coasts, and then the elitists, the elites that read and make a lot of money believe they should be.
But Stewart, isn't it possible that what you're actually seeing is, and I say this as somebody who, I worked for 10 years at the Washington Post. I don't have a shadow of a doubt that there's a left lean in major print media in the United States. And so I have no argument with you there, but it seems to me the most obvious explanation for the removal of conservative versus liberal accounts is that there is a violence in contemporary conservative rhetoric that does not exist in contemporary left of center rhetoric. And so you have all these people who their left counterparts are not making statements that could reasonably be understood as threats, and they are. And so they get removed, but the actual bias is a bias in favor of the rules of the terms of service.
So that's a possible argument. Maybe you just haven't been exposed to enough left-leaning violent threats. So there's plenty of that.
You remember that I'm the guy who went up against Glenn Greenwald.
That's right. You're right. And Glenn,
I know of what I speak about the left.
Okay. So, yes, and I got some of that. I got brief blowback from Glenn too on a few of my tweets. But let me pick one example that I think is striking because it shows that the rules may be the same, but how they're applied is hard to justify. And that's the New York Post articles about Hunter Biden's laptop. There was never any evidence that was a Russian scam, that a misinformation, disinformation operation. There was a letter from a bunch of people in the heat of a campaign who said, well, that's the kind of thing the Russians would do if they could. And they were all from the intelligence community. And all of Silicon Valley seized on that to say, well, you can't publish that. You can't repeat that story. That story has turned out to be true, and it is a shocking scandal. It's still producing shocking scandals about Hunter Biden's ties to the Chinese government. And to say we're not going to allow you to tweak that story, I think you can't interpret that as anything other than we don't like this story and we think it will hurt the Biden campaign, so we're going to squash it. I don't see another explanation, and I don't think that that it wasn't misinformation. There was never a good case that it was a Russian disinformation operation, and nobody ever changed their mind effectively, at least not until the election was passed. I don't think you would have that with something that could change the election that would have hurt Trump. And if it would hurt Trump, it was gonna be distributed until somebody proved it was wrong.
I think that one can see what's happening now is in some sense an overcompensation for what happened in 2016, which did seem like Carl Schmitt's dictum that liberals can't tell the difference between friend and enemy. As the line has moved, should go the other way, right. The center keeps on moving, and it's really hard for these social media platforms to figure out where the disposable income is headed. It seems to me that it's not so much conservative liberal bias against conservatives, but it's trying to figure out how to where the advertising money is, and so I think it much more cynical than you seem to think of it. But I want to bracket that for a moment, and I want to ask you, as somebody who listens to your podcast all the time, and I love it. And I want everyone to know that I think that this is a phenomenal. The Cyberlaw Podcast, I think, is a phenomenal podcast. I think it's really done extremely well. You will learn,
and available on Lawfare.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I mean, I think it's a really just absolutely. You run a great show. I learned so much from it. But the one thing I have to say that's been slightly upsetting to me during the Trump administration is I feel like you don't appreciate the danger associated with Trumpism, that the gadfly in you is strong, and you and I respect playing devil's advocate, but I'm wondering how much devil's advocate you played vis-a-vis the Trump administration, and whether you are worried, like in your heart, worried about where the country is headed, not from cancel culture, wokeism, the New York Times editorial board, but from the other side that really does seem to be, I would say, anti-democratic.
So that's fair. If you've listened to the podcast, you know I'm not exactly Donald Trump's biggest fan. I think he's incompetent and narcissistic, and would be a disaster. It would be a disaster to have him back. because the thing that kept him from really screwing up was that he hired a bunch of traditional Republicans and did not realize that they were going to sometimes tell him that he couldn't do things he wanted to do. But by the end of his administration, he realized that if you hire second-rate people and put their job at risk, they will come in and tell you all kinds of things you can do, and they'll do them for you. Instead of having that in the last 8 months of the first term, we're going to have that in the first 8 months of the second term if he gets elected. So I don't want him to come back. But at the same time, I thought that the effort to impeach him and to tag him with the Russia gate was an effort to basically undo the election and to treat him as illegitimate, and that was showing contempt for the people who voted for him. We voted for him, and we should live with the consequences and follow our traditional approaches to politicians we don't like. So that's kind of to the extent it's nuanced, that's my nuanced take on Trump. But I don't know that I am completely convinced. I think if he is a authoritarian, he's a really incompetent authoritarian. He's just bad at this. I mean, this was Ben's early take, right? That the incompetence was going to override the malice, and by and large, that was true. To say, oh, it's such an it's such a authoritarian culture on the right, I just don't see it that way. I think the people on the right are mostly doing things that they learned from watching the left. So
I would love to hear you say a little bit more about that, because that just strikes me. I mean, the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision in Bush versus Gore selected George W. Bush as president, and the Democratic candidate said, "Okay, rule of law." I just
when he'd run out of other options, yes.
When Trump ran out of other options, there was an insurrection.
You're right. Trump shouldn't have done that. I completely agree.
But not just should have done that, but it goes against everything that we hold sacred and important in this country. It's not a small thing. It's what I thought we stood for. And so I do not see that on the center left at all. You would never hear the New York Times editorial board come out and push for Al Gore to ignore the decision of the High Court. So I just have to say that I don't. You're such a smart, intelligent, experienced man. It seems trollish to deny.
And maybe it is, right? Because we've established what I am now. I do have a significant troll element to my personality. But the New York Times did not exactly say, "Oh, you can't passively pack the Supreme Court." That would be shocking. That's an idea that suddenly is in bloom. It's not going to happen, but it's certainly as counter to our norms as refusing to accept that you lost the election. And for all the talk, I completely agree. There was not an enormous outpouring of the computer-generated election fraud. At the same time, I think that if you are a Republican, you're entitled to say, hey, all of that stuff that they told us was about making it easier to vote in the coronavirus turned out to be really ignoring the risk of fraud. And we don't know how many ballot harvesting initiatives were carried out, how many ballots were dropped off because they could be, because that was suddenly acceptable because of the laws that were passed, or the laws that weren't passed, but the decrees that were issued with coronavirus as the reason. You could say, okay, that was a legitimate response to the coronavirus, and maybe it looks that way if you're on the left. But if you're on the right, it sure looks very convenient for a well-organized bunch of people who want to maximize their ability to get out the vote in ways that would previously have not been considered legitimate. And so feeling that the election was tilted by Democrats taking advantage of something, not letting a crisis go to waste, given how close the election was, I completely understand why people feel like they were robbed. My view is whatever it was that Goldwater said about the Panama Canal, hey, we stole it fair and square. We get to keep it. If the Democrats did this and stole the election, well, fine. That's our general principle is if you can steal it that way, fine, you get to keep it.
But Stewart, just to be clear, this was mostly Republican officials who did this, right? I mean, the actions that people are objecting to in places like Michigan and Wisconsin and Georgia, less so in Pennsylvania, but to some extent, these are not the actions of mostly Democratic officials.
I don't know. You're right that in some of those close states, it was Republicans. And, they may have been persuaded, oh, my God, this is a crisis. You've got to do something. But it certainly turned out to be very convenient. That plus all the money that was spent by fairly lefty groups on taking over responsibilities that the secretaries of state couldn't actually carry out, and saying, well, that's all right, we'll help staff your office. And there are reasons to think that those efforts might have tilted in favor of getting out the vote in high Democratic areas, which are also urban areas, which were easier to reach. But all of that strikes me as reasonable objections to the way the election was handled in retrospect, given how close it was.
I want to ask one more question before we go to the audience. One thing that I think all of your, many of your center right to center left, to even some far left friends have puzzled about with you over the last few years is, Stewart, one thing that you have always stood for consistently across time, administration, policy dispute is nobody has ever had an unpleasant conversation with you. Nobody. You're the concept, like when you're arguing with people, these are the most pleasant arguments around, and you never get personal.
Glenn Greenwald has come close.
Well, we're talking about people here.
I was going to say, we're talking about human beings, right?
Right, but also, I venture to guess that if something got unpleasant between you and Glenn, it was not you that got unpleasant.
It could be.
But what you're defending intellectually is a culture that is, among other things, relentlessly unpleasant. And one of the things that I find jarring about, you're not a defender of Trump by any means, but you are a sort of anti-Trump person.
Yes.
And one of the things that I always experience a little bit of cognitive dissonance about that is that the intellectual culture of this sort of nasty, pugilistic ad hominem is so un-you. And I'm curious, like, does that bother you? That like the world, the gentility that you represent and the friendliness and combative fun that you represent is nothing in the world that you're criticizing people for taking offense at.
Well, maybe, you know, somebody once said, you know, what's really frustrating about Baker is that he can say the most outrageous things and not make me feel like he's insulting me. And so it may just be affect over content. I
think your targets know they've been insulted. They just don't get angry. That's a difference.
Well, that could be. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right, David Bott, you have a question in the queue, and your camera is not on, but we can hear you. That is anticipating a subject that Stewart really wants to talk about. He and I have been going through a piece of his about it back and forth. So please revert, sir, to your original question, unless you really want to talk about your second question.
Well, the original question, hasn't it already been answered in terms of can algorithms have bias? Well, I guess...
No, I think Stewart has not yet begun to speak on that subject.
Mr. Baker, it's great to see you. I'm sorry that you can't see me. Long time listener, first time talker to over Crowdcast, but we did meet at RSA a couple of years ago, back when people met in person. Stewart, you have said on multiple occasions and very, very emphatically that algorithms cannot be biased, and it almost sounds like you've said, oh, this is just a lefty conspiracy that caused us to not like algorithms. So I'm interested in your thoughts.
Okay, so first, I may actually go to RSA this year. It's always a close call, but so I look forward. Maybe I'll see you there, right? Although nobody ever sees anybody at RSA, as far as I can see.
Because it's one giant infomercial.
That algorithms can't be biased. They can be. Obviously, they can be inaccurate in ways that could have a disparate impact on the basis of a variety of capabilities, and indeed you can write algorithms that are biased if you give them a data set that itself has the bias. So, for example, that if you wanted to take your algorithm, your decisions about how to control, how to moderate content, and if Facebook said, we're just going to take our current decisions and we're going to have the machines learn how to do it from watching our current decisions, I would expect that it would recapitulate the basic approach that we've seen already. I do think, and this is where I've been having a back and forth with Ben, which I really value, I have to say. He makes me a better thinker. The notion that AI bias against women or racial minorities is somehow the natural state of artificial intelligence, and that we have to do something very special, and we have to take special care to address that. I think that's the product of a combination of researcher bias and press bias, and that the data just doesn't support that very well. There is data that says that it was harder for algorithms to match up darker faces and to some extent younger faces and female faces back in 2016. Those indications of inaccuracy and the biases in where the inaccuracy shows up are disappearing. And the last data I saw, there actually was a bias for being able to match female faces that was was more accurate on female than on male faces. So we've been sold the story that the algorithmic bias is a profound and enduring problem, and that the only way to solve it is to impose fairness on it. And if Ben has gotten to the end of the draft I sent him, he knows what I'm going to say.
I haven't started the new draft yet. So
okay.
I'm behind.
Well, there are people who first, there's lots of pressure now. You can't sell an algorithm that does face recognition or a lot of other things without attesting to its fairness. And there are people who will let you attest to the fairness of your algorithm. And the way they do it is they say, hey, why don't we make up a world in which there is no difference, right? We live in a world where men make more money than women. We will just imagine a world in which the incomes of men and women are the same, and we will construct an artificial intelligence algorithm on the basis of fictional data. And that fictional data then will be imposed on real data, which ends up basically being a kind of affirmative action program for whatever it is you're using the AI for, a quota system that nobody gets to see, because all the shimming, all the debiasing, they would say, but the biasing, I would say, of the algorithm has happened behind the scenes, and when you show up and start running it, you can't see it. And I think that's a profound change in our political climate. By and large, the imposition of quotas when it's subjected to a vote fails. But if you can impose quotas by getting researchers who believe in them and journalists who believe in them and relatively well-to-do liberals who believe in them to smuggle it into the algorithm, then you're going to get your quoted relief without ever having to go through a democratic process on it. So I think that's a big problem. It's not quite the same as there is no bias. I think you can get bias. My worry now is that bias is being injected in the form of fake data and other tricks designed to achieve an artificial society that we'd all like to live in, but we don't live in.
Michael Nelson, the floor is yours.
Thanks.
Hey,
Always good to see you, Stewart. I'm going to pick up a little bit on a question that Tom Strand asked about transparency, accountability, and national security.
Well, don't pick up too much on it, because Tom Strand is actually in the queue and is going to ask that question himself. Don't steal Tom's question.
I'm just going to give an example of transparency. We worked on Clipper chip and encryption way back when, and I always thought that it would be wonderful if I could go out and actually talk about all the stuff that I learned in SCIFs and in super secret briefings. I also went to Computers, Freedom and Privacy. I think it was a year after you did. I didn't learn from you, and I got heckled and ridiculed and ended up on C-SPAN in rotation at 2:00 in the morning for at least 6 months.
It's the highest form of fame.
Yeah, I was getting fake mail for weeks and months.
Right.
But anyway,
we call that being canceled.
But I knew if I could share more of what I knew, that at least the smart people would say, okay, I didn't realize all that electronic surveillance was having that much of an impact, and that the world was that much safer because of what was being done. Do you think there's any way that changing the debate and actually being a lot more open about what kind of events have been prevented could make Americans and maybe even Europeans a little more likely to support rather than fear what NSA and the CIA do?
So first, it's great to see you. Mike Nelson was the most formidable wielder of analogies that I had to argue with in the
and a regular member of the Greek chorus. I want to add.
Yes, he's terrific. He once actually challenged me to a duel of analogies at 20 paces. So I first, there's really two things. I think the debate about the Clipper chip and encryption has moved to the point where everybody can grasp it because it's now a law enforcement issue, and it doesn't have to be cloaked in national security and important things that we found out that we can't talk about. Everybody knows there's criminal evidence that they're not able to get because of encryption, and that debate is now playing out in that context. And interestingly, in Europe, it's probably more likely to result in controls on encryption than in the US. That's my guess. Certainly, when you look at the UK wall of establishment, lack of enthusiasm for end-to-end encryption, I think the willingness to compromise encryption because of a faith in the social contract and the institutional integrity of law enforcement it's stronger in Europe, oddly, than in the U.S. But persuading the Europeans that they should stop screwing around with our intelligence capabilities and imposing, say, human rights obligations on NSA that they don't impose on any of their own internal and external intelligence agencies. No, I think that in Brussels, nobody cares about national security, but they love getting in the way of the United States. And this has been a perennial way to get in the way of the United States and force the U.S. to come to the table and talk to them like equals. And they're too enthusiastic about that ever to give it up.
Yeah, I just want to, as we say on this show, foot stomp that point. I once had to go to Germany to speak about NSA, what they called in Europe l'affaire NSA, and I was impressed in doing so at how of all the things I had ever read, seen, or people I had talked to about European attitudes toward what they call data protection and we call privacy and surveillance, the person who had most prepared me for what was in the room was Stewart. And the reason was that Stewart's basic thesis about European privacy law is it is an attempt to regulate U.S. behavior. And nothing could have been a more accurate account of what the Europeans in the room were fundamentally about, honestly.
I would just say that, like, Europe is a different country. That was a joke, but they really do have. I just put an incredibly good article in the chat, a link to the article in the chat by my colleague Jim Whitman, showing that the culture of privacy in Europe is very different than in the United States, and that I do remember, it must have been like 6 weeks ago, Stewart, and you do, how many podcast episodes have you done? Like 380 or something?
385 this week.
Oh, yeah. 385. And so I will just say I was jogging in the park, and I remember hearing you make fun of the Europeans for their privacy, and then for privacy fetish, maybe that was the word you used, but the word it stuck in my mind. And then you complained that not Gmail, but Google was reading your Google Docs. And so, like, the thing is, two things. First of all, we will only appreciate European attitudes towards privacy if we don't see it as trying to troll the Americans or kind of sour grapes about European hegemony, about American hegemony, but understand that the culture of privacy is very different in Europe, and they are arguing about things that are extraordinarily important to Europeans in the same way in which Americans talk about their guns, that is just completely unimaginable to Europeans, number one. And number two is that when it happens to you, not you, Stewart, in particular, but when it happens, when one's privacy is invaded, it feels different. I just want to throw that out there, and also to make call
it does. It does. I have a more fully formed objection to privacy law, which probably we won't get into. But the short version is, it is so vague because nobody really knows what privacy is. They just know it when they feel it, because then it hurts. That the only way to write it down is to write down something that everyone violates all the time. And as we lose our sensitivity about a particular thing, like our location history, we stop seeing it as a wrong, and then the law stays on the books, but it's only used by powerful people to squelch unpowerful people.
I would agree. So that's why I like the Cyberlaw podcast so much. And again, I'm gonna plug it, because you actually you point this out when it happens, that they are often quite discriminatory and are used by legacy platforms to squelch foreign upstarts. So I would just say,
yeah.
Go ahead.
I'll just close by saying I actually spent one year giving awards for the worst abuse of privacy law to serve the interests of the privileged, and I called them the privies. And we gave awards to a whole bunch of people. It was a lot of fun. I should have continued. It was just too much work.
I will just say that I would not begrudge Europe any of its privacy, as Stewart would say, fetishism, if they did not try to impose it on us. Paula, the floor is yours. We apologize for Alicing you. It was not intentional.
No, you're fine. So I'm actually from the Metro Detroit area. My parents are Lebanese Catholics, so I understood a lot of your earlier references, and it kind of plays into my question a little bit, because I'm wondering how we have conversations about national security, both relating to the Middle East or when we're talking about southern border immigration, without people acting in bad faith, steering the conversation. And I mean people that are actually racist, versus the actual trade-offs that we have to make versus on like who we're going to let in, and morality, and versus, efficiency.
Yeah, good question. First, I have to say, I remember I grew up in the 50s in Dearborn when pizza was sort of an exotic dish, foreign food. But every Saturday we got baklava. So I think it is hard. We've just passed the point where this is going to be easy on either side. I think there are plenty of people who are taking Islamophobia as, trying to turn it into the accusation from which everyone must flinch in the way that racism is. And with some cynicism about it. But that doesn't mean there aren't people who are reflexively hostile to Islam, because, their only experience with it was 9/11. I don't know that there's a great response to that. Part of it is there's now a substantial not just Middle Eastern, but Islamic population in the United States. And I like to think that we're going to end up with a an American Islam the way we have an American Catholicism, which is to say it's been filtered through a bunch of American values, political and otherwise. Unfortunately, increasingly those values are, well, if you can catch somebody saying something that you can describe as racist, you win. So that's not an ideal approach, and we've had that for a long time. I mean, if criticism of Israel tends to be shouted down as anti-Semitic if you're not careful. So I don't have an answer to this. I do think we need to be careful about who we let into the country and vetting them, and I think we've done a pretty good job of that right up until we just started flying people more or less in from Kabul without much in the way of double checks. But that was an emergency. It's more or less stopped. I'm not sure I've got an answer there, but I think the only good answer is something that tries to be very careful about who we let in. That will mean that the first generation of immigrants will probably not be hostile to the United States, which is probably true for the first generation of all immigrants. It's their kids that you have to worry about, that they will grow up feeling, with a chip on their shoulder about whatever their identity is. I don't have an answer to that. I do worry that we're building a culture in which identity is so important that having a chip on your shoulder about your identity is going to be an increasing source of conflict in our society.
All right. Tom Strand, you get the last question today.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a very, very broad question, so I was hoping you guys could narrow it down, perhaps. So I was wondering what you view the relationship, the proper way to understand the relationship between democracy and transparency and accountability in national security is. So a common refrain you might hear is something like, in order for democracy is necessary for elite accountability or policymaker accountability, and in order to have rational democracy or a knowledgeable democratic body, you have to have some level of transparency, and maybe you could zoom that in somehow. Is that logical? Yeah. Thanks.
So this is an unresolvable tension. There's no solution. I do think we have spent 50 years trying to find ways to reassure people that even though they can't be told everything that is done, there is somebody who has the responsibility to protect the privacy interests and other interests of Americans, and that set of that's where the FISA court comes from. That's where all the oversight committees come from, and the inspectors general and the privacy and civil liberties officers. There's a lot of institutions. I used to joke back in the 90s that there were at least 6 people whose careers would be made if they could find me violating somebody's rights. And I thought that was, pretty good protection.
See, I just want to say no lefty hates the FISA court more than Stewart does.
That's probably right. I have real doubts about the FISA court, and I won't go into all of them. So we're going to have to renegotiate those institutional rules, because the criticism that is coming against national security authorities is increasingly, and for the first time, coming from the right. People who believe, the deep state sabotaged the Trump administration, kicked off the an improper Russia investigation, and I think we have to respect that concern, especially since the Russia thing didn't really work out, and ask the question: have we got enough controls to make sure that in future there is not a partisan misuse, as opposed to a civil liberties misuse of the national security authorities? And I think we have not done enough. We haven't had that problem until recently, but now we certainly have the perception that that's a problem. And I would argue we probably do have a real problem. And we need to find ways to reassure people on the right that the entire national security apparatus is not lined up to improperly investigate and intimidate them. And that's a different set of problems, because they don't express their concerns in the language of civil liberties, which we've all been taught to respect. But that's a lefty point of view, and it's always been rolled out in service of left-wing groups. We need to find a way to talk in a respectful way about the concerns on the right, that they have become the targets of the authorities that used to be arrayed in at least the imaginations of the left against leftist groups.
We are going to leave it there. I am not even going to argue with Stewart on this point, however sorely I am tempted. Stewart Baker,
invite me back. I'm happy to come back.
You should come back early and often. It's great to see your face.
Somebody said that I reminded her of her dead father, and I hope I'm, not completely, but
well, not in the dead sense.
I never grew up with a father, so I'm pleased that I have settled into that role.
We will be back tomorrow. Stewart, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us. I don't remember. Oh, tomorrow we will have the estimable Jeff Kosseff, who is teaches at the Naval Academy and is, I think it is fair to say, the world's foremost authority on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which he wrote a book about. And he's a very thoughtful, serious guy who can answer all your 230 questions. That will be 22 hours and 51 minutes from now. And until then, Scott?
We can't have fun anymore, but we can have every week the Cyberlaw Podcast, brought to you by Steptoe and Johnson, that does not necessarily reflect Stewart's views or his pets. But I will say it's a real learning experience. And I want to thank him for doing such a superb job at that.
Okay, thanks.